it's quite an interesting city in which you can actually walk. And the 50-minute city is a concept which embraces exactly that. I'll talk just a little bit into understanding what the 50-minute city is, so we all have a basic understanding of the concept. So the 50-minute city is nothing but a concept which tries to enable services, affordability of living, then of course community, caring, so activities which connect us as people, of course space for walking and crossing through different parts of the city, and of course also public space in which you can enjoy and do different activities in. So the 50-minute city does only embrace this concept, but it also puts a disclaimer, kind of. He says, we know cities need data to operate. They do need, of course, quite well-supplied mobility options. And I would like to quote a little bit of Jane Jacobs in this and embody what she said about technically cities are just spaces in which you want to be a part of. So if you don't want to be a part of the city, what you are going to do is find a way to not actually be a part of it. Not live in the city, not communicate in the city, and not move in the city. And that's something I think one way or the other we can all see, especially with the challenges we've been facing in these 7 to 10 years lately in Tirana. And of course, the 50-minute city does respond to a few specific challenges we are currently living in Tirana. So, of course, it tries to address a little bit what happens with congestions in terms of traffic, and of course, stress for people and are made of people. So when we talk about any kind of concept, I think it's very important to keep human-centric ideas close to us to understand what that really means. Of course, decision-making processes such as centralized investments, and I put this with a little bit of caution in it, but also current attempts into contributing to small greening attempts or very targeted investments, I think they are also quite creating a bit of inequality in terms of how we manage the territory and how we see the territory these days. And I think in Tirana this is quite obvious, and I'll direct a little bit of your attention later on into the fact that we have a lot of good examples, amazing examples being done in this city. However, they are all directed in the center of the city, and I think that we are a little bit missing the track here. And of course, cities have increasing mobility challenges, and of course, we need to understand what does that mean for the future cost of living in the city as well, because all of these added costs do make cities a little bit unlivable, undesirable, and then of course they start to make some attempts of, changing the urban fabric, but also changing on how people, interact in the city. I don't think it's working. Okay. So just to put a little bit of understanding, I think most of you already know that, and I'm just going to say just two very important things which I think are important. Territory plan during the 20s, which also was a very strong kind of way of planning, which created the boulevard with the surrounding buildings, and it kind of changed from this little core that were oriented for trade purposes and workshop facilities and services to actually a very structured planning of the city, creating this kind of core in which the city would later on use in terms of development. And I think a second very important part of our city would be a very big influence of the Tirana-Durrës corridor, which I think completely shifted how development was positioned, but also influenced in the future. And of course, the local development plan did nothing but embodied some of the elements of the past, so we brought the ring road back, and that's a very strong investment in physical infrastructure, which it's a very interesting way of approach, but question is it the right one? I'm not giving you an answer on that, absolutely not. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. I think it's so complex. But on the other hand, I would only like, by the end of this discussion, to just think about a little bit, what does that mean? So what are we doing, and should we do it like this? Maybe we should just think about how things could be different. And that is why I want to try and way of thinking. So technically, just to see a little bit, Tirana is quite a walkable city. So I took the two extremities, not municipality speaking, but within the urban area of Tirana. So I included the outer ring road as well. And if you see it, so from Uzberdishti, which is the western part to the eastern part of the city, it's no more than 7.5 kilometers, which is 1 hour and 45 minutes of walking, which is actually not that much, if you think about it in terms of walkability and possibility of walking. Of course, there is a few other elements to this discussion, because you can't just walk for 1 hour, 45 minutes. That would be exhausting. But what I'm trying to say and show you a little bit is that we do have that possibility. So we are there now, and if we make the right decision making, perhaps we can make our ideas a reality and actually help the city not to be car dependent and stop investing in it to be a car dependent city. So our main approach would be to basically understand a little bit of, and I will bring you an example in which I personally worked on for 5 years during my doctorate studies, and I'll bring you just a tiny bit of fragment on that element, because of course it was such an enormous amount of work and I couldn't possibly go through all of it, but I will just explain to you a little bit of my findings in the area. And I took the area outside of the newly built outer ring road, and I did that intentionally. I chose 3 different areas of the city, mainly in the western part, to understand a little bit how is services being distributed in the area, and this concept of 50-minute city, which allows us and also requires to have close services to a 50-minute radius in which you can actually do in 50 minutes. And also understand what happens to these components. If they are present, maybe we don't have to work so hard. Maybe we can only start implementing small things that it needs and then start directing and closing this gap between actually walking and cycling and urban transportation, and then finally, if it's necessary, using the car. So, of course, our main approach was to focus our interventions in city center, and instead of actually working just in the city, to connect the city center with the outskirts of the city, peri-urban areas, in which now are being developed. And this is a crucial moment because we can go there before they are actually consolidated. And then it will cost us less. And of course, at the same time, we will be able to create actually livable neighborhoods. And that's such a big question because it's so important to invest in the right kind of decision making. And of course, introducing walking parks and activity itineraries would be such an important thing to do. And we have to make a decision making, you know. We can plan how we want our city to be, or we can just let the market tell us, and we are currently letting the market tell us. And I wonder, is that what we want to do? Because we are so focused into making the city center and within the older ring road accessible and good and livable, and that's such a good intervention, but we should think a little bit what's happening beyond that as well, because it is part of the city. And what I want to say to you is that we could build like this, which is the current ring road we have, or we can do this. And that's such a controversial way of doing it because design does not fix everything, of course. But, I mean, small elements such as understanding what proximity means to us, understanding what services mean to us, and, of course, design paired with them, gives us a possibility to explore a different way of thinking. And it's radical, I understand, and it's so hard to do. Cities are trying to do it all over the world because now it's such an interesting concept that we are going back to our roots, so people cannot stand the life they are living anymore. We either move to a private house and live a quiet, beautiful life, or we live in city centers and we are constantly stressed and tired, and we just don't love the city we live in. And that's such a huge compromise to do. And so this is my neighborhood in the lower part. And I brought that because that is my previous neighborhood. And I just wanted to show you a little bit what is currently happening in the city, in the areas I told you. And so this area, it's somewhere around here, this part. And so I lived there for 8 years. When I started living there, there was no infrastructure. There was only the buildings. And the infrastructure was used to dump garbaging because there was no garbage collection in the area. And yeah, it was completely a strange way. People would only access the entire neighborhoods from one street. And it was madness to go through that. It took you an hour and a half to go within the neighborhood because everybody drove. There was no public transportation, and the public transportation that there is, because it's not completely undersupplied, there is a close by it in 1,000 meters public station. However, it's very, I would say, not well managed because you don't know when the bus is going to come, so it's a bit of a Russian roulette every single day you go to work. And sometimes traffic, and of course, the fact that a lot of people are waiting continuously with you makes it impossible for you to actually use public transportation. I think that's such a big indicator because I would rather walk 45 minutes to work. That's the amount of time it took me to go to work. I worked previously at Polish University, and that is the amount of time it actually took me to go from there to my work. And I would rather do that walking than actually wait for the bus, than completely be squashed in the bus, be late, and then be exhausted by the end of my trip. I also tried biking, but that's a completely other story. So just to show you a little bit what I've worked on previously, it's like I tried to understand a little bit what are we missing. So if we propose cities like 50-minute cities, let's see where we are, and let's understand a little bit if it is possible, feasible to do, because after all, it's all a lot of pretty words, but it comes down to economic investment. And it comes down to a lot of political will. So these are things that need a certain amount of security instruments to put in place. But also it has to have an acceptability, a certain acceptability and attractability for people to actually be willing to change their way of life. And I have a philosophy in which I think that people can be trained, if you can say this, into walking and into preferring walking, because I think till now we haven't had the option of choosing. And I think that's a very, very big indicator. So these are the 3 areas I've tried to understand. This is the outer ring road. And so the first one is an area in which has already been built. It is when you take the highway of Tirana. It's just in the overpass, which has already been built since the 2000, had a very big pressure to build because it was very close to the infrastructure. And then I chose an area which has been constantly being built, which was the area I lived in, Variousconcepts. So constantly you had new development, because previously it was very low density and people start buying land and developing very high density. Sorry. And then thirdly, I chose an area by the lake on the other side of the street, and if you've passed there, you've seen that they are now currently being built. And they are a completely different story. So we continuously build the same way. We don't really understand what kind of connectivity do we need for these spaces. And of course, that's something very challenging to do. But at the same time, I think it's something that we need to consider now because it was going to be so much later on. And so the components I tried to understand a little bit was, first of all, it was so hard to say we need more services. That's such a flat information. What we tried to do, because this is also a colleague of mine supported work, was to understand what a complex component means, and we call these horizontal and vertical components, because you cannot just understand density by seeing the building. So what we needed to do to understand the actual density of the area was to consider the volume of the build area, but also what kind of permeability does this volume have with other buildings in the area, but also what kind of floor area coverage does it have, what kind of surface ratio in terms of the space does it have, and of course also what kind of void between the spaces we have as public space. So all of these elements came together to understand a little bit what was happening in the area, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of results because this was a 5-year journey. But I mean, this is a little bit understanding on how the distribution of services was within one of the areas. I used GIS to make these parameters. So we built a model to understand if each of these horizontal or vertical components could be measured for each area, and then we built a model to bring them all together and create a matrix which eventually would tell us what is happening in the area. And I'm only going to share one finding with you, which was the walkability index we found in the area, which was quite low. It was lower than 30%, I mean, lower than 30% of the 3 case studies together had actual walkability, good walkability, if we could call it that. And I would call it that because we did a matrix into understanding what do we call a good walkability, what do we call bad walkability, then put that into numbers, of course, through different methodologies and to understand a little bit what was going on. So my point is that we do have a lot of good things in the area. For example, intermodality was very low in all of the 3 areas. Attractiveness for people was so low. People did not like their neighborhood. They only lived there because it was the only thing they could afford, and this was universal throughout all of the areas. And then, of course, in-betweenness, we called it, but the spaces connecting the 2 buildings were so neglected that people didn't want to use them. They felt they weren't safe. Reachability in some of the areas was quite good. However, the walkable area, according to the measurable of the indicators, was very low. And this is such a strong indicator to understand what is really happening. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about the 50-minute city. But not because the 50-minute city is such a great concept, but we want to develop it, and great for us, we're going to win everything. But because the 50-minute city, the walkable city, the 20-minute city, it really doesn't matter. But what it matters is that applying kind of these principles, we can understand what happens between the relationship of the building and the movement in between the building. So territory and building should have a very strong connection in order for us to understand it. And what we are trying to do is, in terms of urban development, so create green, livable neighborhoods in which people want to walk, live, and why not in the future develop some kind of activity, social life. Of course, we want to do, people-centered design, in which is not only embraced by people, but why not initiated by people? So we put a little bit out of the strain that municipalities are currently living, because we do have a little bit of a culture thing in which we just wait for municipality to do absolutely everything. And that's impossible. It cannot be done, it cannot be solved, it's so unmanageable, and it's so unrealistic, to tell you the truth. At the same time, of course, understand a little bit what kind of appropriate density would be for the city, because we've been playing a lot with towers lately, and I think that's a very good thing. I embrace density, but I want to talk about human density. I don't want to talk about density, which just empowers the economic part of developing a city, but I want to talk about a density which actually embraces these principles and lets us understand where we can go and lets us live in a city in which we actually want to. Of course, all of these elements are just trying to give a understanding and cohesion throughout the planning territory, and of course, they are just an instrument for us to be able to do better. And I think that's all it is. It's a manual on how you could do better, and then it's up to you to understand, design, and of course, implement some of these principles. And this goes through horizontally as well. I mean, it has so many elements, and I mean, what we're trying to achieve is, become accessible, share our territory, not just keep it closed, because that's so controversial and important to do. And of course, why not, through this, also attack some of the country's climate goals we have, because we are currently living a lot of heat islands, and we never talk about how air moves in the city when we build. And that's so important, and nobody talks about that. And we never see it, and we never understand what kind of role it has, because it's not being talked about. And I think all of these elements are so important for the cities, and I think we should only give it a chance and try to explore it and make it a part of a conversation. And then, I think things sometimes take their toll. If you talk about them enough, people start being interested, and if they are interested, sometimes they are interested in being involved to make them happen. So I think that's just, good things that could happen. I mean, there's so many good initiatives for the future. I'm not going to mention them because I think I've talked about 30 minutes and everybody hates me now. Thank you so much for your time.